Hi everybody and welcome to CYB-530 Securing and Administering Windows OSs. So I think we can all agree that the Windows universe is confusing. We have Windows 10, Windows 10 Home, Windows 10 Pro, Windows Server 2016 in various flavors. We have Windows 7, Windows Server 2008, 2008 release 2. We have Windows Server 2019, we've got Windows Mobile, Windows IoT. Let's make sense of all of these. So the main product lines for Windows really are the Windows desktop versions, and those are for individual user PCs. And these are also the end user PC versions that if you end up working with an organization that uses Microsoft Windows, and how many those are we'll see in a little bit, you will be in charge of. Then we have Windows Server versions, and those are for enterprise IT management. These are the control centers that will allow you to efficiently manage and supervise the Windows user versions, the desktop versions. Then we have scaled down versions of Windows that are called Windows IoT. Those are the smallest versions that typically sit on smaller devices like Raspberry Pis even. And then we have the now deprecated but still alive version of Windows for mobile devices, Windows Mobile. So the support for Windows Mobile ends in 2019. So let's delve right into the Windows desktop versions. So as we can see here, I pulled up the desktop market share for 2016, for August 2016, and we see here that all Windows versions that we're seeing here have an 88.82% share of the operating system market, and that operating system market includes Macintosh and and others, so Linux devices as well, and this is just for personal computers. So we can see that in 2016 we have a large percentage of users using Windows 7, despite the fact that Windows 10 was rolled out in 2015, and some early adopters of Windows 10 here make up about 12%, and really interestingly Windows XP with also just about 12%, well 11.42 is still kicking. So let's go a year and a half later, or a year and 3 months later, and we're seeing that the Windows desktop market share has increased from 88.82% to 89.73%, same survey. And now we are seeing that Windows 7 has lost some users, but astonishingly enough, even though Windows 10 has been around since 2015, not that much really, 6%. We are seeing that Windows 10 has increased users from 12% to about 7.5%, but also we're seeing Windows XP and Windows 8 are still alive and kicking. So the reality is that you will be working with a lot of Windows 10 in your organizations, and you will be working with a lot of Windows 7 in your organizations. So if we look at the timeline of Windows PCs, of the Windows OS on PCs, we're seeing that in 1981, this is when MS-DOS came out. That's the very start of personal computing. Of course, we all know that 1984 really Macintosh OS became very popular, and in 2015 Windows 10 was released. That's version 1507, and since then we have had a number of updates, since Microsoft claims that Windows 10 will be their last operating system ever, and it will be supported by a number of updates. That's why we have a big jump in version numbers here from 2012, Windows 8 in 2012 to Windows 10 in 2015. Windows 9 was quickly rolled out to offices and then taken back again in favor of Windows 10. So we have a number of updates here. Right now, the version we're looking at is called Redstone 5. And we are expecting the 19H1 release of Windows 10, which is the next major feature increase in early 2019. I'm guessing somewhere in the March-April timeframe. So let's take a look down memory lane, shall we? MS-DOS, August 1981. This is what it looked like. You may remember it if you were born earlier. If you are born after 1981, obviously you may not remember this. Windows 1 looked like this. We went from the command line to a very basic GUI with even some basic games here. We had limited multitasking, but we also know that multitasking has not been the strength of Microsoft Windows from the get-go, which is why a lot of folks then took the Linux route or the Unix route in those early days. And then in 1987, in December, Windows 2.0 came out, and as Windows 2.0 came out, the interesting part is that Apple filed a lawsuit against Microsoft and HP, which was the baseline hardware at that point for Windows 2.0, and for copyright infringement, and Apple lost at that point. And then we are looking at Windows 3.0, and that is the first incarnation of Windows that I vaguely remember from my own use. So we have here memory management that was increased. I remember seeing the system clock here, and so the work that was done in order to bring Windows 3.0 more into the desktop arena was done by David Weiss and Murray Sargent in 1989, and we're seeing that the games look better as well. So then that was followed by Windows NT, which was the beginning, the real beginning of the Windows Server area, and why that was we'll see in a little bit when we look at more of the Windows ecosystem. And Windows NT came out in 1993, and all of a sudden we're looking at not just a single processor architecture but a multiple processor architecture. This is why we're looking at that. Then Windows NT was really designed as being the Unix killer, and in order to take over that Unix server market that had established itself based on AIX at that time, and also Solaris, the beginnings of Unix Solaris. And interestingly enough, Windows NT was based on VMS-VAX. VMS-VAX is the old DEC Corporation Unix flavor as well. So at that time, Bill Gates also hired David Cutler, and David Cutler then brought this VMS-VAX architecture over to Windows NT, and I find that very interesting because we can see how Windows was really pushing against the Unix market here, or trying to push into the Unix market. So, but Windows NT still remained some sort of desktop version with a server flavor. And then later on, in terms of the desktop versions, we have the Windows 90 version, starting with Windows 95, which was called Chicago. And here we have the x86, the 32-bit architecture that is starting here. And that continued with Windows 98, that improved the power management, but really didn't do much in order to the desktop design, other than adding standby and hibernate modes. And that then moved into Windows 2000, which for the first time added the NTFS, the New Technology File System, which also then allowed to set the EFS, the encrypting file system, on top so that files could be encrypted. And this is the really beginning of Microsoft reacting to security, to developing security issues. And at that point, Windows 2000 also included Active Directory. We will see what Active Directory does for us later in this course. So after that came Windows ME, the Millennium Edition, or sometimes also called the Mistake Edition, which not only restricted access to real mode MS-DOS, but it was not stable. When it was rolled out, the testing was not where it should have been, so that went off the market really quickly after a year, and was substituted by Windows XP. And Windows XP was the first real major player in businesses, in American businesses as well, where we have a taskbar, where we have a start menu, where we have a nice looking GUI. And so at that time also Windows became aware of the piracy problem and then used product activation and activation codes, serial numbers, the way we know them today, to reduce or address that problem. So after Windows XP, we are seeing Windows VISTA, which included the Windows search area in the taskbar, and then some other clip-ons to the sidebar as well, and integrated speech recognition. But Windows VISTA was really big, and really did not run on some of the hardware, so it was kind of hard for users and for organizations to upgrade, knowing that they would have to buy entirely new hardware to run Windows VISTA. This is why the popularity of that waned as well, in favor of Windows 7. Now Windows 7, we've seen, is still alive and kicking very well in American organizations today on the desktop or end user market. And Windows 7 really is one of the big stable Windows releases that you may end up still supporting, as I said, if you are looking at a Windows-based organization. Now that was in October 2009. Let's remember that the iPhone was first introduced in 2007, and Apple was trying to make big strides towards a cross-platform integration. So this is why in October 2012, 3 years after the introduction of Windows 7, Windows decided to do the same thing with its Windows Mobile integration with its online services called SkyDrive at that point, and Xbox as well, the gaming system, and developed Windows 8 and released it as well. And here in Windows 8 we have a complete change from a desktop operating system approach to a tablet approach. The users did not take that very well because there was no start button, you have these tiles all over the place, and that was the big criticism of Windows 8. Also, Windows 8, called Jupyter, did not really have the customization ability that Windows 7 had in terms of security, so it was hard to lock Windows 8 down. So 3 years later, because we didn't see many users shift to Windows 8, and if you think back on the pie chart that I showed earlier, really Windows 8 is a very small segment of the entire operating system market. We had Windows 10, and Windows 10 came out in July 2015. Now it came out, it had some rough edges, but it came out as a free upgrade from Windows 8, and we know why. The start button came back, the search box came back, so it is a mixture between the tablet approach that we had with Windows 8 and then the more organizational operating system customization, the hardening that can be done with Windows 7. So it's a compromise, right? So what are we looking at when we're looking at Windows 10 and Cortana, which can or be turned off or left on? We're looking at 4 different editions, really. We're looking at the baseline editions. Those will be the home version, the pro version, and pro for workstations, all for end users. Then we're looking at the organizational editions, and those will be Windows 10 Education, Pro Education, which allows a USB-driven setup for schools, for example, or also for universities. We're looking at Windows 10 Enterprise, which is the edition that you will most likely be using in any kind of business setting. And we're also looking at Enterprise LTSC as the long-term support version, which interestingly enough does not allow any feature updates in order to provide a stable enough platform that can be supported over 10 years. So then we have the minor editions such as IoT. I already mentioned IoT is very small and low cost, so then we have the discontinued editions, Windows 10S, which was designed for low-end tablets, specifically for schools, and Windows 10 Mobile. We've seen that on Nokia phones, that's being phased out, and Mobile Enterprise for business-owned smartphones is also on the wane. So when we talk about Windows, and we talk about Windows 10 and the PC editions, really we're looking at the baseline editions and the organizational editions. So if we look at Windows 10 and we look at all the editions here, in an overview we see that Windows has provided us with a nice matrix here, and we see that the only one that is included in the long-term servicing branch is Windows 10 Enterprise, but we're also seeing all these features here. And then when we look at the customizations for Start menu, for Windows Defender and the firewall, for Cortana, the voice-driven assistant. And then we're looking at the customization of Windows Hello, which is the authentication mechanism on the device, fingerprint recognition, facial recognition, those kinds of things, and then the multitasking also here. And we are seeing that those items, those core features, are germane to all of these editions. So that's the Windows personal computer editions. Now let's take a look at the server versions. So we have to understand that the servers pretty much grew up of Windows NT. Now we do have the standard editions for the servers, and we have smaller editions of Windows servers. That's the Windows Home Server, the HPC servers, Windows Server Essentials, Windows Essential Business Server, which is now discontinued. Those are all variations of the Windows Server that come with limited feature sets. So until Windows Server 2012, all editions had a Windows Storage Server edition with increased data storage. And after Server 2012, those versions were consolidated, or those editions were consolidated to standard and data center. So Windows Storage Server became the data center edition. And they can all be as of Windows Server 2012, which you may encounter in many business settings. Many business settings still run on Windows Server 2012 and have not upgraded or migrated really to Windows Server 2016 yet, because the architectures are so vastly different. So from 2012 onward, though, it is possible to deploy Windows Server editions on site, as in company-owned or organizational-owned hardware, and also in the cloud, including Amazon Web Services. So if we are looking at the LTSC, that is the long-term servicing channel releases, remember long-term servicing is a big deal, especially in organizations where organizations really need user support, and not just on the end user base, which we saw in the Windows 10 editions, but also in the servers editions, right? So the long-term servicing channel is supported for 10 years, and the LTSC releases, instead of just providing a command line implementation, include a complete GUI desktop, but also support the smaller setups that just come with the command line, such as Core and Nano. And later in 2018, we may see the Windows Server 2019 to be released. That's an optimistic date. If you ask me, I think that the Windows Server 2019 release will coincide with the next big update to Windows 10 early in 2019. So these are all the versions that we have of Windows Server, and as you can see, I was not lying when I said Windows NT was really where Windows Development forked into the personal computer section and the server section there. So now if we look at the smaller releases of Windows Server, those are the basic feature updates. We call those the semi-annual channels. So every 6 months really, Windows Server will release a new version, and these versions are supported for 18 months because then they are supplanted by a new version. So in other words, we have the big releases and we have the small releases. But typically right now, when you step into an organization, you may see anything from Windows Server 2012 to Windows Server 2012 second release to Windows Server 2016, with 2019 being on the horizon, but we probably will not see that implemented until sometime down 2022, 2023 is my guess. So now those are the big editions of Microsoft Windows. If we look at some other Microsoft Windows editions, we see that there really is a whole lot going on in Windows land. And MS-DOS, in fact, which is the red ribbon here, was published as a GUI-less operating system into 2000, long after the GUI-based versions or the GUI-driven versions were already on the market. So I find that rather interesting, and here is where you can see the fork off from Windows NT into the Windows PC sphere, and then also the Windows Server sphere. So here's hoping that after this trip down memory lane, we have managed to untangle the jungle of Windows editions and Windows versions a little bit into the personal computing areas, the server areas, and the deprecated mobile areas.